Trump is now underwater, and he wasn't before, with men. Don't forget the gender divide that happened in 2024. The women went overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris, and men went for Trump. Now he's underwater with men, including with young men and young people.
Hey, welcome back. Genuinely glad you were here for this one because this clip had me stopping and rewinding multiple times. So what you are about to watch is Piers Morgan sitting down with Megyn Kelly. And what starts as a conversation about a ceasefire very quickly turns into something much bigger. Megyn, who nobody would describe as a left-wing voice, starts pulling apart the entire justification for this conflict piece by piece. She is not holding back, she is not being diplomatic, and by the time she finishes, she has basically said out loud what a lot of people were afraid to say. I put my full reaction below, so do yourself a favor and stay all the way through. The last few minutes especially hit completely different once you have the full context built up. And before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. I genuinely love seeing where this community is spread across the globe, so do not be shy. All right, let us get into it.
I mean, a fascinating assessment. I mean, I remember early on you picking up, as I did, on what Rubio had said about the reason why America went in, and then the immediate backtracking the next day when they panicked and realized they'd let the cat out of the bag. This was clearly a Netanyahu-driven operation. He had persuaded Trump to come with him. Then we had Antony Blinken saying, well, actually, he tried to do this when Biden was president, when Obama was president, and both times those two guys said, no, we're not going to come with you. And then he didn't attack. So he clearly got third time lucky with an American president that would come with him. But I remember early on, you and I and others who dared to suggest that we take Rubio at his word, that actually this was all at Israel's behest. Once again, we were anti-Semitic if we said that. This was a hatred of Israel that was driving our warped, crazed minds. And then you read this deep dive in the New York Times. Fascinating. I mean, what's most fascinating to me, they've got somebody on the inside telling them exactly what happened in that situation room, which is fascinating. But when you see it all laid out, it's crystal clear. That's exactly what happened. That Netanyahu got in that situation room at the White House, like you say, unprecedented. The way he had the guy from Mossad on the big screen, he had him there with his... It was like two equal partners. And he persuaded Trump in that room to go in. And I think Trump will regret this. Well, you're right. He may not care. He may want to just say, moving on, it's a big victory, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is nobody thinks this was a big victory for the United States. Nobody can see anything but actually a bit of a humiliation. Not militarily, because America can beat anyone when it comes to a military punch-up. But what Iran has now discovered is that as long as it can control the Strait of Hormuz, it can control the global economy, and therefore it can, if it has enough patience, play out the long game with the President of the United States, who will have to cave, because ultimately it's going to cause him so much economic and political damage, he has no choice. That's what's happened here. Trump hasn't brought this to an end out of some great desire for peace. He's brought it to an end because he could see that the economic and political damage was getting worse by the day.
Because the Iranians wouldn't fold. They realized what the pressure point was and that it was working. And they watched Trump's poll numbers spiral downward in every piece of the coalition that elected him. And they realized that their ability to just withstand the beating was working, was getting them to where they needed to get. Because, look, there was never majority support behind this war. There wasn't some groundswell of support behind this war, right? There was a Republican-based support for the war, but the Democrats didn't support it, the independents didn't support it, and very soon into the war, the Republicans stopped supporting it too. MAGA supported it. As MAGA dwindled, by the way, it was already only about 15% of the population. It's getting smaller by the day. President Trump 3 weeks ago declared that to be MAGA, you have to support Mark Levin, upon which multiple formerly diehard MAGA people who are dedicated to it said, I'm out. If those are the stakes, I'm out. Why would I support that warmonger who's frothing at the mouth over the idea of lives being cost in Iran, civilian or otherwise? He's a disgusting fool who's well past his prime. We should not be listening to him, but President Trump is obsessed. On Sunday, he tweeted out that the Supreme Court should be listening to Mark Levin.
I know.
All nine justices,
I don't get
which
it
would
because
double his viewership.
This is the part that should make every single person stop and think, because what Piers is laying out here is not a theory. It is a documented, sourced, confirmed sequence of events, and it tells you everything about how this war actually started. Here is what you have to understand. Piers points out that the exact same pitch to drag America into a war with Iran was made twice before. Twice. And both times the answer was no. And both times, nothing happened. No attack. No war. Just silence. Think about what that tells you about who actually had the power to start this conflict. And then Piers said this. He said this was clearly a Netanyahu-driven operation. He had persuaded the president to come with him. That is not coming from a liberal pundit on a left-wing network. And that is Piers Morgan saying it out loud on his own show. What really gets me is the part about the Situation Room. Piers described it, and he was right to call it unprecedented, where it was like two equal partners sitting across from each other, the head of a foreign intelligence agency on a big screen, in the American Situation Room, selling a war, and it worked. And here's the thing people keep forgetting. When Piers and others said this out loud early on, they were called anti-Semitic. That was the response. Not a factual counter, not evidence, just a label designed to shut the conversation down. And now the New York Times has published a detailed inside account confirming exactly what they said. The people who were called conspiracy theorists were right, and the people calling them names had nothing. You have to sit with that for a second.
Yeah, I don't get it because you've been loudly calling out the folly of this war from day one. I have, Tucker has, Candace Owens has, Joe Rogan has, Theo Von has. I mean, there is a massive cross-section of people in our world, which is what I call the unfiltered world, where you're not controlled perhaps by other forces that own networks and so on, that sort of send out a directive about what you should and shouldn't be saying. So in the free spirit world, where you can say what you really think, pretty much everyone has been agreed. This looked like madness. There's a very interesting piece, I think, with Stephen Chung pops up in the New York Times piece, who emerges as one of the smarter characters, actually, that Trump has around him, who said, well, how does all this sit with we're not going to go and wage war in the Middle East, which is what we campaigned on? How does it sit with America first? This will have an obvious effect on prices, on inflation, on gas pump costs and so on. How does any of this work? And there's no real answer, according to the New York Times, in the room to that. He just raises this spectre of, this is the elephant in the room. This is exactly the opposite to what we campaigned on. So I think politically it's been disastrous for Donald Trump. And I just don't understand, other than he got bamboozled by Netanyahu, why he took such a gigantic risk.
I don't either. And it wasn't just Steve Chung, who is a master messenger and saw the storm coming. It was J.D. Vance, who, according to the New York Times, was in there specifically saying it's going to fracture the coalition. And boy, is that an understatement. Trump is now underwater, and he wasn't before, with men. Don't forget the gender divide that happened in 2024. The women went overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris, and men went for Trump. Now he's underwater with men, including with young men and young people. The young person coalition that Charlie Kirk delivered to the president is gone. They've abandoned Donald Trump. The working class, Piers. The latest poll that just came out showed he's 2 points underwater with the working class. That's been Trump's base from the beginning. They were the unshakable foundation that got him elected over and over. And they're gone. They're very angry. They care about what's happening in Iowa, not Iran. They don't want days and days and more weeks of debates over the Strait of Hormuz. No one cares. They care about their own lives. They care about the fact that they can't pay for health care. They can't buy a home. Young people cannot get a home, even though two people are working nonstop, round the clock, with no vacations in this country. President Trump promised he would do something about that. Now we see the leaked soundbite saying, can't really worry about anything at the federal government level other than military. Everything else has to be done at the state. Then they pulled that down off the internet because they didn't mean to share it. He said it at an Easter breakfast that was supposed to be private. Well, it's going to be the campaign ad for every Democrat in these midterms. So he's lost working class, he's lost men, he's lost young people, he lost...
This is the part that blows my mind every time I watch it, because Piers names the people who got this right from the very beginning. Tucker, Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn. These are not people who agree on everything. They do not share the same politics. They do not share the same audience. But every single one of them looked at this war and said, "This is madness." And then Piers makes this point about Steve Chung raising the elephant in the room inside the actual meetings, asking the question, how does any of this sit with what we campaigned on? How does it sit with putting the country first? And according to the New York Times reporting, there was no real answer. Nobody in that room could answer it. They just kept going. That should disturb you. That should disturb you. Because the people closest to the decision knew it contradicted everything they had promised, and they moved forward anyway. Then Megyn says something that I think is the most honest political assessment in this entire clip. She says Vance warned specifically that this would fracture the coalition, and she calls that an understatement. And then she walks through exactly what happened. Working class voters gone, young men gone, the gender gap that was supposed to be closing, reversed. And she lands on this line that is so simple it hits like a freight train. She said they care about what is happening in their own lives, not about a strait of water on the other side of the world. That is not a political point. That is just reality, and nobody in power was listening to it.
Hispanics by some 50 points. Every single gain with Hispanics is now gone. It's eradicated. Blacks, he had made some inroads with black voters. Done. You name it, they're all gone. The question is now not who has he lost. The question is who remains. And sure, it's the diehard MAGA. Trump can do no wrong. He's some savant. Whatever he says is right. That's great. He'll always have those people. You can't win national elections with some fraction of 15% of the electorate. The vast majority of Republicans would call themselves America First, but not necessarily MAGA, certainly not the way Trump is now defining that term. And he misunderstood his own base twice critically in the past year, and both times are really undermining him right now. One was Epstein, thinking he could just say, Epstein, who still cares about that? No one's talking about Epstein. He misread the base, which very much cared about Epstein, not so much because they care about Jeffrey Epstein, but they care about elites being able to get away with murder and protect each other when the common man cannot. And the unwillingness to turn over stones that the base had been demanding be turned over so we could figure out, is there some sort of child predator sex ring? Is there an elite cabal working to hurt people that gets protected because they have money and we don't? And Trump could not get rid of that with a shrug of a shoulder. And ultimately it resulted in legislation he had to pretend he favored that was crammed down his throat and he had to sign, though it had enough loopholes in it to drive a Mack truck through. But in any event, it was a step forward on Epstein that he didn't want to make and was forced to. And this is the second one. And this is a much, much bigger and more serious betrayal of what he ran on and of what was important to his base, which does include the America Firsters and not just MAGA. Or as Marjorie Taylor Greene has been saying, at this point, she's not America First, she's America only. And I think a lot of us are getting to that point. We are sick of being the policemen of the world, of being dragged into conflict after conflict by Bibi Netanyahu, by Israel, who's supposed to be our special ally. But what they're special at is getting us to fight their wars and get involved in their conflicts that they can't fight by themselves. That's what Dan Kane said to President Trump the day after Netanyahu came for the 7th time and was sitting in that situation room like an equal. He said that they're great on intelligence. That's supposed to be the area in which they're so special to us. They share their intelligence. They're great on it. But that intelligence doesn't always seem to pan out. Like, the regime will fall easily. The Iranian people will revolt in the streets and take over. With how? They don't have guns. Bombs would be raining down. Wasn't this thought through? There isn't regime change. The Iranian people are arguably worse off than they were before. And it's all based on Bibi Netanyahu's special intelligence, which cost at least 15 American lives, the fracturing of the Trump coalition, probably at least the next 2 elections for Republicans, not to mention the amount of lives and blood and treasure that was spilled in the Middle East. So great job.
Oh, when Megyn says eradicated, not lost, not slipped, eradicated, that word choice is doing a lot of work, because she is not talking about a bad poll week. She is talking about years of outreach, years of coalition building, years of real political progress with communities that had never leaned that direction, gone. in one conflict that nobody asked for. And here is what I think people genuinely do not appreciate about this moment. There is a concept in political history called coalition overreach, where a leader gets so focused on one dramatic move that they burn the relationships that actually kept them in power. You saw it with the British Empire in Suez in 1956, a government so convinced of its own strength that it moved without its allies against its own economic interest and paid for it politically within months. And the moment this war started costing more than it delivered, the same pattern kicked in. Megyn makes the point that Israel's role is supposed to be sharing intelligence. That is the deal. That is the partnership. But she says, and this is key, that intelligence does not always pan out. And the specific intelligence that was used to justify this entire operation was built around assumptions that simply did not hold. The population would rise up. The regime would collapse. The strait would stay open. None of it happened. And then she closes with a line that I genuinely think is one of the most devastating political verdicts you will ever hear delivered this calmly. She says the whole thing was built on that intelligence, and it cost at least 15 American lives, and probably the next 2 elections. And then she says, so, great job. That sarcasm carries the full weight of everything she just spent 10 minutes saying. No screaming, no dramatic music, just great job. And somehow that is the most cutting thing of all, because it means even someone who wanted to believe in this had to admit there is nothing here worth defending.